Welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. I'm Eleanor Haley.
And I'm Lisa Williams. We're the mental health professionals turned grief friends turned co-founders of the website What's Your Grief.
In this podcast, we talk candidly about all things grief, from pop culture to grief theory.
No tilted heads, no soothing tones, just us and our grief friends exploring the always devastating,
often confusing,
and sometimes even funny experience of living life after loss.
Hey, welcome to the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and I'm joined by Lisa. How are you?
Hey, I am doing all right. How about you?
Pretty good. Just busy with all the back to school stuff. And you know what? Actually, while we're on the subject, I will mention that back to school can be a really difficult time for people who've experienced loss in their family. If a child is going back to school who's been home for the summer, who maybe experienced loss and is grieving. Maybe if you experience the death of a child and you're seeing all the reminders of the back to school stuff on Facebook or in your communities, it can just be a tough time. It's one of those, I think, in some ways, for some people, one of those unexpected grief triggers. And if you're, worried about a grieving child, maybe this is not unexpected. You've been thinking about it a lot, but just wanted to acknowledge that and also say, if you are supporting a grieving child, that we've written about the topic of going back to school after a loss, and there's something called the Coalition for Grieving Students that has a lot of really helpful information. National Alliance for Children's Grief can be a really helpful resource. So while we were on the subject, I just thought maybe it was helpful to say that. I think we even have a podcast on it. That's why I'm not going into it in terms of our grief support for this, because I think we actually have a podcast on this. So if it's something you're looking for, you can go back and look for that episode. I'm right. There's a podcast on this, right?
Yes, we have. Yes,
okay.
We did do a podcast about this. And it covers not just, going back to school. I feel like the association is back to school for the end of the summer, but really it's at any time, just if there's been a death and you have a child who is going to be going back to school, and how to help them get prepared, how to help the school get prepared, all of that. So yeah, it's there in the library.
Right. What we want to talk about today is not about children, but it's interesting because it has sort of roots in thinking about child development. We want to talk about the topic of attachment styles and how they may be relevant in grief, or how they may be, even impacted or changed or affected by grief. And so we have a lot that we want to cover with this, because there's some background that I think is needed, and then we want to make sure to have plenty of time to talk about how this really relates to grief. So I think we just want to jump right in and get into the topic of attachment. I guess let's back way, way, way up. I used to teach Psych 101, and so, there's the Psych 101 version of explaining attachment. There's a lot to say about it, and a lot that has been said about it over the years. So we're not going to get too in depth. We're not attachment therapists. We're not attachment experts, but we have a decent working understanding of it. So I think we'll try and impart that working understanding to our listeners if they're not already versed, and hopefully we'll give kind of a good overview of it. And there is so much online about attachment if you want to look it up. There's so much online if you want to look it up and learn more and read more. There's a lot of information out there. So here's kind of the Reader's Digest version of attachment. So attachment refers to the close emotional bonds that develop between infants and their caregivers. And as one might expect, a child's first attachment usually occurs with those main caregivers who are really there doing the feeding, the changing, the cuddling type of things. And when John Bowlby first started talking about attachment, it was back in a time when that person was usually going to be the mother figure, right? It was like a time he was working in a culture where the person who was home doing all the feedings, doing all that stuff was the mom. So you'll hear them talking about the mother a lot. But I think for our conversation today, we want to kind of broaden that a little bit, because we know the person who is taking care of that child might also be a father figure. It could be a grandparent. It could be a whole host of people. So really, we want to just think about who are those people who are there responding, taking care of the child in those very, very early really months, actually. This is thought, this attachment and how it is formed, and we'll talk about different types of attachment styles, is thought to be really important, not just for a baby's development and how they kind of establish a sense of trust in the world and trust in people, but it's also thought to perhaps inform how a person connects and forms attachments and has relationships throughout their entire lives. So even though it feels like maybe such a small thing, it can have really far-reaching implications. Now, that doesn't mean that if your caregivers in the first couple months, I don't know, let's say maybe they were grieving and weren't able to respond in exactly the way they would like to. That doesn't mean that things can't be repaired over the years. And there are different types of therapies that help people who maybe haven't developed the most secure attachment with their kids. And so there's things that can be done. There's ways our attachment change. So it doesn't mean that it's like predetermined for the rest of your life, no matter what, that you're going to have this attachment style. But it is thought to be important. It's thought to be really influential. And based on this attachment, children develop internal working models of the dynamics of close relationships. This is really based on some very simple things about whether or not those caregivers respond in really a consistent way. When the child cries and has needs, are the caregivers there to respond and feed the child when they cry, to change their diaper regularly? And it doesn't, at first, I think a lot of psychologists thought that our attachments, of course, they're going to be based just on caregivers feeding the child and responding to that need. But actually, there's been a lot of research. There's a famous Harlow's research with the rhesus monkeys. Again, I'm not going to get into that, but it's really famous research. You can look it up. Showed us some evidence that is also based on that comfort that caregiver gives. It's not only based on did they give you a bottle or change your diaper. It's also based on whether they picked you up and maybe rocked you and provided comfort and gave you some snuggles and things like that. So Bowlby first started talking about this. And then later on down the road in the 70s, Mary Ainsworth came along and started talking about different patterns of attachment, different attachment styles. And there's a lot of different kind of permeations of this, but there's three main ones that I think we can really look to. The three main ones that we often talk about are secure attachment, one that is more anxious, and one that is more avoidant. What most kids go on to develop is a secure attachment. So that's the good news, is like most infants develop this secure attachment. And that's really the ideal kind of attachment. It means that you trust that your caregivers are there. They're going to respond to your needs. They're going to be there if you need a hug. When you get a little bit older, they're going to pick you up from school at the end of the day. You can trust that they're going to respond. Now, we're not perfect, right? There might be times where a parent doesn't do exactly what a child is expecting or provide that comfort, or maybe they're late picking them up. We're not perfect, but generally speaking, we've developed this ability to trust, and that helps us to trust in other people as well, is kind of the idea. And so, so when kids are really little, if they have this secure attachment, one of the benefits is that they have this secure base. There's this thought that if they have this secure base that they know they can return to if they need protection or if they need something, that helps them to better be able to explore the world a little bit. A way we often describe this is if you have ever seen a toddler maybe at an unfamiliar party where there's a lot of things going on and there are a lot of people around, that toddler may be really tentative at first and maybe wants to sit on the parent's lap, and they're a little nervous about climbing down and playing with the toys or playing with the other kids. But then, like, once they are like, okay, mom or dad is here in this room, I know I can return to them. Let me kind of get down on the floor and start playing a little bit, or let me play with this other child and maybe even wander into the next room, because they have that secure base that they know that they can return to if they need to. And when you're young, it's usually knowing that that caregiver is close by, but as they get a little bit older, we're able to hold this working model of that caregiver in our minds. We can imagine them when we're not around them. We can know that they exist and that they will return to us even when they're not with us. And so again, like I said before, we can be maybe dropped off at school and know that we will be picked up at the end of the day. So this is a secure attachment. There are two others, like I said, and well, there are many more than that, but the two other main ones we want to talk about is the person who has a little more of an anxious attachment. And both anxious and avoidant, basically the idea is that the responding to the child's needs in the very early years was a little less consistent for whatever reason. Maybe it was that they responded sometimes, but not always. So there's different ways that we can see this, but a lot of times we think about like a caregiver was a little less responsive or a little more inconsistent in their responding. So it's difficult because the child hasn't learned to trust that the caregiver will be there if they need them. They maybe haven't learned to trust that the caregiver will return to them, that the caregiver will come back, that the caregiver will pick them up at the end of the play date. And so there's a little more anxiety around it. And there's an inability to really use that parent for comfort a lot of the time. These children, there's a certain way that psychologists can like watch a child in the environment, observe when a parent leaves and returns, and kind of identify some of these things. But some of the tendencies that they notice with anxious attachments are a child may appear anxious even when the mom's near or the parent is near. Like I said, they use mom a lot. They may protest a lot when they leave. Now, kids, all sorts of kids do that, right? But this is something we see commonly with this. But one of the things is they may protest when the parent leaves. But then when the parent returns or the caregiver returns, they're still not comforted. They're still, their acute stress response is still really high, and they're still kind of sullen and a little bit mad. They're not really able to use that caregiver as a way to feel comfort. They're unable to feel secure enough in that caregiver's presence to calm themselves down or to go play and to go explore. And like I said, a lot of work has been done to see whether these types of attachments persist in adult relationships. And they have found that there are correlations. So as an adult, we might see people who are more clingy and needy in relationships, like the thought of living without a partner or of being alone in general causes a really high level of anxiety. At the same time, they may have a harder ability trusting. So they may really feel that they need the person, but also feel a lack of trust. They may have more of a negative self-image. And so there's a lot of different correlations that they find, but they have a harder time kind of having that secure attachment, having that comfort in that caregiver. And then finally, avoidant. Now, this is a little easier to describe because this is really the child who doesn't really seem to need the adult one way or another. They're not distressed when they leave, and they seek little contact with them when they return. I used to show videos of what this looks like in classes, and it really just looks like a kid playing because they're not bothered by it. They may, though, internally be very bothered by it, but they don't really show it on the outside always. And as an adult, as you might expect, this looks more like somebody who's a little more detached and distant. Maybe they feel that they don't need anybody. They may like identify as kind of like a lone wolf, though they may not use those words per se. They don't necessarily feel that they need to have long-term relationships or have kind of relationship goals like getting married and having a partner for life, that sort of thing. They do not necessarily want to depend on anyone else or have anyone else depend on them. Adults with this attachment style generally avoid emotional closeness more than others may. And so this is more kind of like that I don't really need anybody type of approach to things. So that was kind of like a really quick 101, very incomplete. So anybody out there who's like trained in developmental psychology, sorry, you're probably cringing because you can think of like 10 things I didn't say and a couple things maybe I didn't say exactly as you would have said. But hopefully that gives kind of an idea of what these attachments look like and how they might become patterns in our life in the future.
Yeah, and I think the one thing that's really important to highlight is in the early days of attachment, these were theoretical and it was based on observation. A lot of it was happening based on looking at kids, watching what was happening, tracking patterns that happened into adulthood. And over the years, as science and technology have advanced, it's been really amazing to see how much we've learned that reinforces the accuracy of what was gleaned just from external observations. I think one of the things that is really striking is they did a study in epigenetics that really looked at children who hadn't had that consistent response from parents, and they actually were able to see epigenetic changes to sort of that gene that tolerates stress. So they are able to see that in that young kind of infant to early toddler age, that made changes that could stay with people on an epigenetic level, which was significant. I think the other thing that was really significant is you mentioned that idea that even though the one child you might see that outward expression of their distress, the avoidant child, it can look like they're not bothered at all. But when they started to actually do some observations of children where they were able to track what was happening internally and look at some of their stress levels, their stress responses, stress hormones, heart rate, the things that we would associate with stress, the avoidant child was still having that same internal stress response. They just weren't showing it externally as an adaptive kind of coping mechanism they just had established. So I think it's really interesting when we think about these patterns, if we see them in ourselves, that there are some really fundamental, like sort of biological things that are part of it.
Yeah, you may hear people use the phrase anxious avoidant to describe a certain type of attachment style, and that's what you just described. They're, on the outside, they seem cool, calm, and collected, but when they take kind of their vitals on the inside, they see that during these periods of separation, they're showing the same internal responses as the other kids. So they are anxious, it would appear, based on their physiological responses, but avoidant on the outside. And I think that makes sense. Like there are people who definitely respond to anxiety provoking situations with things like withdrawing, or with like shutting down a little bit or separating themselves. Like this is something that we do in grief, right? So I think it's interesting, as we'll talk, like sometimes experiencing a trauma or a loss or grief can really put us into some of these areas in our responding to others that we wouldn't have normally been in, typically in our relationships in the past.
Absolutely. And they certainly have said that they think part of this can be if a child feels like they have been kind of punished for the expression of their emotion, they didn't get those things, that can sometimes contribute. And again, if we look at that makes sense in childhood, it also sometimes makes sense in grief when we feel like maybe we're being punished for our grief expression. That can cause people to feel like what they should do is stop showing their grief expression because it is causing them to experience, further distress or be shunned by other people. So it really, I think it's interesting. The research does look at attachment into adulthood when it comes to grief. And I think that there has been a lot of questions. Bowlby didn't actually spend a lot of time back when he was writing about loss thinking about the different attachment styles and grief. He did to some extent, but it was not a deep dive. But in recent years, when there's been more emphasis on attachment, there's been an interest in seeing, does our attachment style affect how we cope with loss? And studies that have been done to try to answer that question and explore that. And, one of the things that's important to remember is, one, attachment styles are flexible. So I think it can sound a little bit fatalistic, like, oh, you get this attachment style in childhood and then you kind of are going to have it forever. There's flexibility with it. We can heal certain things about our attachment styles. We can have certain relationships where we have a very secure attachment and then other relationships where we have a more insecure attachment because of the nature of the relationship. So there's flexibility there. And in the research that we do in grief, there are some trends that they see about attachment styles and how it impacts grief, but it's not guaranteed either. So if you're somebody who knows that you have a bit of an anxious attachment style, just because research shows your grief might look a certain way because of an attachment style that is avoided, or anxious, it doesn't mean that is a guarantee. This is always just trends. But what they do find is that our attachment style does seem to shape our grief reaction. And people who are more securely attached in their attachment style in the research tend to be able to adapt to their grief in ways that are a little bit easier. They're usually able to process it over time in the ways that look more predictable and what we might expect to see in grief. I use the word easier, and I always sort of cringe when I do that. But I think just in terms of the research, we do see on that bell curve that it tends to be that folks who are securely attached are less likely to have some of the extreme outlier experiences in the way that they grieve, whereas anxiously attached people did in the research tend to struggle a lot more after loss with intensity of emotions. The intensity of their emotions tended to be a lot higher, and they often perceived themselves as less able to cope with their emotions. So the emotions were really intense, and they just didn't have the same confidence as securely and avoidantly attached people to sort of believe they'd be able to manage some of those emotions. And I think that's interesting to think about when we go back to some of the early attachment biology stuff, because one of the other things we know is that some of the ways we learn to calm ourselves down as babies happens when we're being held and rocked by a caregiver when we're in distress. They find that in those times that's actually when babies start to learn how to do some self-soothing and to try to breathe more deeply and to lower their heart rate a little bit to match a caregiver's when a caregiver is doing that well. So if we didn't get that, or that was inconsistent, we might have just at a very foundational level, we might not have gotten quite as much of that self-soothing. And so our confidence might not be quite as high that we're able to kind of cope with that distress when it comes up and deal with it. So we see that in the research. And in the research, avoidantly attached people are complicated in the research, because some research has found that they tend to maybe suppress their grief and have some difficulties as a result of suppressing that grief. And others have found that they tend to be fairly resilient and have suggested that, sort of like Eleanor described with the seeing a baby playing, you might not see that they're experiencing a lot of distress. They might not identify that they're having a lot of distress around it. But what a lot of the researchers note is it can just be tricky with avoidant attachment styles, because you don't know what might be hiding in some of that avoidance. So it's a little harder for them to do research around it.
Yeah, that is a tricky one. And I mean, one trend that we see come up a lot with avoidant is that these are people who often develop a strong sense of independence from early on. And so perhaps, just a guess, a lot of the issues that people have with support systems and interpersonal secondary losses and conflicts may be minimized just because they have adopted that attitude of it's me and it's only me, kind of taking care of myself. And so I could see that being something that was perhaps more navigable for someone, though, although we do know that having people, no matter what, can be really helpful, even if you only have one person. So in that sense, they may be at a disadvantage. And so, yeah, I do wonder how much that sense of independence and perhaps that emotional distance that we have in relationships may impact a person after a loss. So lots of kind of questions that I have about that. But yeah, it is more difficult to really assess. Is this, it always is with avoidance, right? It's always is this healthy and normal in your typical way of doing things, or is this somebody who's avoiding realities or not talking about emotions or whatever? And we never want to assume one or the other until we've had a conversation or really kind of assess the situation. Because I think a lot of times with people like that who are a little more avoidant, people just assume they're in denial and they're repressing and they're not talking about their emotions, when it's like, no, maybe this is just kind of how they cope and how they emote and how they are. So it can be tough with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that one of the things that is helpful for us to, I guess, think about when we look at how grief affects attachment is that ultimately the loss, or I guess maybe I should say how our attachment affects grief, and kind of both. It's sort of, I guess, is a two-way relationship. We have this experience of loss, which oftentimes gets described as activating the attachment system. So if you think about the idea that we have these leanings in what our ways of developing attachments are and how we cope with relationships and function in them, that when a death happens, that all of a sudden we go back to sort of really fundamental attachment behaviors. It triggers whatever our default is of trying to figure out how to feel close with a person who's gone, and having a lot of distress when we're trying to process the reality that this person is not in the world anymore and we are never ever going to see them again. For anyone, no matter that their attachment style, that is what Bowlby talks about, is the most extreme attachment distress that we can have, is losing someone who we were close to and attached to, whatever type of that relationship it was. And we look at how people kind of naturally respond after that. And Bowlby and others talk about the idea that one of the first things that happens for all people is that they do this kind of yearning and searching and just wanting to create a closeness with the person who's gone, like that feeling of I don't want to get rid of any of their belongings. I want to hold on to everything. Maybe I'm walking down the street and I imagine seeing them everywhere. Anytime a car pulls up the driveway, I hear it and I immediately kind of think that it's them. Our system is still wired for this deep attachment. And Mary Frances O'Connor talks about this in her book, The Grieving Brain, that the attachment system is really connected to these neural maps that we have of our world, that she describes the idea that when we determine figures of attachment in our lives, whether that's romantic partners, our children, our parents, our friends, that our brain, and in this fundamental level, has mapped the world to kind of always know where they are. We always, even if they're not in the room with us, we are always aware to some degree of how we would reach them. Are they doing okay? That's kind of running in the background. And when they've died, our brain is sort of searching, trying to figure out what to do, trying to look through these maps and do this, and not finding the person. And that at its core just really it disrupts everything for all types of attachment styles. That is just the fundamental of grief. But then I think when we think of that, and then what starts to happen and the rebuilding after that, that's where maybe we can see how attachment might influence that rebuilding.
Yeah. There's a really great paper that we use anytime we talk about continued bonds, and also anytime we talk about this, that really outlines kind of like an overlaying of continued bonds with attachment. And I'm totally blanking on who wrote it right now, but we can link it in the show notes. We use it all the time. But one of the things they talked about is, if you think back to when I was describing that idea of the secure base with the caregiver and the toddler, when they're really young and they haven't developed that internal working model, they're proximity is really important and having that secure base until they can develop that internal working model, until they have an ability to keep that caregiver psychologically present, that source of comfort, that source of security psychologically present, at which point they can then kind of branch out and just know that I can keep that person with me in a sense. I know how to reach them if I need to. I can call them on the phone. I know they will pick me up at the end of the day, that sort of thing. And so over time, we develop this psychological closeness, this psychological proximity. And what this paper really talked about was how in the beginning, like what Lisa described, we are all about trying to reestablish that physical proximity. And we have that kind of anxiety and that yearning and that searching and that desperation, in a sense, to like hold on to everything that's tangible and physical, their voice, their smell, their items, their belongings. We want to really stay in that moment where they still exist for us. And what this paper kind of outlines is that over time, as we're able to develop that realization that we can have psychological proximity, we can have psychological closeness, we then sort of shift some of our behaviors and trying to connect with that person to being more about just holding them close mentally and psychologically in our hearts and our minds. So it's less about being in that space and holding on to those physical items and things, though we may still do that. It's more about keeping that psychological closeness. And when we know that no matter what happens in life, no matter where we end up having to move to, or no matter what our next step in life is, that we can carry that person forward with us because we have that psychological proximity, then we sort of have that secure base to work from and to be able to move forward into the world, just knowing that nothing is going to erase them from us and take them away from us. But at first, there is that insecurity that if I let go, you'll never return to me. I will never have you. The world will take you. I won't be able to hold on to you. I'm supposed to leave you behind, because a lot of the messages we've received in society are that you're supposed to move on and leave things behind. And so at first, it really does look like that, seeking that physical proximity, and it looks very anxious. But if we are able to believe and come to learn how to have that connection with that person, they can be that kind of secure base that allows us to move forward.
Yeah, and I think it just becomes, when we think of it that way, part of the reason I love that paper is, and they're putting words to something that I think so many of us have experienced as grievers ourselves, or if you're, professional working in the field, you've seen, you get intuitively, it's like, right, that's exactly what happens, that progression of that evolution with time, that I think it feels impossible to imagine in the beginning. Like if you're listening and you're in the beginning of grief and loss, the idea that it's going to shift, I think there's just no way to even feel like that is possible. But often people do experience it. It does make that they kind of put that words to that evolution and connected it. But I think it also really makes it easier to understand some of the things the research has found about the different attachment styles, which is that they've found that people who had that insecure, more anxious style of attachment sometimes had a harder time making that shift from the kind of physical continued bonds that we consider external, like the kind of the objects, the things in the world around them, to what they call internal continued bonds, the ones that we are able to hold in us. And I think we think about everything we've said about attachment so far, it makes sense why, if my attachment style has always been a little bit more anxious and avoidant, if I've always felt more comforted by being able to text a person a lot during the day, know that they're right nearby, hold on to them, feel that closeness. And now they're actually gone from the world, and I'm going to have to at some point start figuring out how to part with certain physical pieces of them, it makes sense that that might be harder for me if I'm a little anxious than if I have that really secure attachment. That's always how I've functioned. I've always been comfortable, if knowing that someone is safe, even if I can't reach them right away or some of those things, then it might be a little bit easier for me to understand how, even if I've let go of an object, that I'm still going to be able to feel close to them inside, to the memory of whatever that object reminded me of, or that, particular time. So I think it makes a lot of sense when we think about attachment, that it could affect the ways that we grieve and continue bonds in some of those ways, that evolution, the timeline of it.
And I like that you mentioned, like, it does take time, a lot of this. That was one of the main things that the paper I mentioned really outlines, is that this is something that evolves over time. And we talk about continued bonds, and people do continuing bonds type of behaviors in the very beginning all the time. But I think one thing that's interesting is that some of what they found was that people who were doing those continued bonds behaviors in the beginning, because they were really seeking that physical proximity, actually those behaviors didn't provide comfort in the same way that they maybe did later on, because what they were trying to do was seek out the loved one. And when they didn't find the loved one, they were met with feelings like hopelessness and despair, and just a reminder of the loss. And so initially, some of those behaviors, we always talk about how continuing bonds can be so helpful, but in the beginning, actually, many people find it's not at all, because it kind of leads to that reminder. It's when we evolve to that psychological proximity that we often see that comfort coming in. Now, that doesn't mean you won't derive any comfort in the beginning. Many people do. Wrapping yourself in their shirt and smelling their smell, like, those are comforting things. So it doesn't mean that it's not kind of a mixed bag, but it evolves and changes. And one of the things that's interesting is, I want to be clear, like, I'm not saying in order to switch over to this psychological proximity, you have to give away all the tangibles, all the things. Like, that's not at all what we're saying. Like, I still have items and I will always have them. But the purpose that these things serve shift over time a little bit. They aren't serving the exact same purpose for the person. And maybe where they had 20 things, they now have 4. You know what I mean? So I want to be clear that sometimes it can be a really subtle shift just in the why behind what you're doing. And so, yeah, there's no prescription about how to continue bonds or the types of things you should be doing.
Yeah. And that a lot of times the evolution, one of the things that happens with time, even when we keep so many of these meaningful objects and these things that keep us connected, is we recognize the way they connect to the internal, or like what it means on the internal. I was actually just thinking about this weekend because I was talking to somebody randomly about cars and getting new cars and researching cars and whatever. And I think I wrote about this on What's Your Grief a long time ago. After my dad died, I had his car, and I was so attached to it. I was very tired. I mean, I was 18 when my dad died, and so I got the car when I was 18, and I drove it into my mid-20s. I mean, I was probably 25 maybe, when it was very clear that I was going to have to, like, get rid of this car. And I was so upset about it. And my dad was really into researching cars, and really, like, he was very particular about what cars he bought. He had a lot of thoughts about cars. And so when I got rid of that car, which was a Mazda, I very specifically got another Mazda because it felt like, I don't know, it made it easier to get rid of that car. And I got that other Mazda, and it was funny. I don't know that I didn't really do a ton of research. I more was like, oh, my dad always got Mazdas. Like, he loved Mazdas.
Yeah.
He researched cars so much. I went to get a Mazda. And so I did that. And then it was after that car that I got really into, in part because of, I remembered so much about all the things my dad, like, said about cars and researching them and whatever. My next car that I got really into, like, researching cars. And I didn't end up buying a Mazda. I ended up buying something else. But I was talking to somebody about this about buying cars, about the research and stuff and whatever this weekend. And I was thinking about it because I was like, I've never really thought about it as like an evolution of continuing Bond's story. I was like, but it kind of is because like where I ultimately landed was like I had been so attached to this one particular car, and then I had been attached to the idea of Mazdas because that reminded me of my dad, and it felt like that was the kind of car he liked. And then finally I was like, oh no, the thing is that like my dad taught me that you should like research what kind of car you buy, and you should, you know, really be thoughtful about it, and you should figure it out, and like that's what's really important. And, you know, that's where I've ended for the rest of my car buying life. And I was like, this is like, you know, sort of that evolution where if I had a Mazda now, it would remind me of my dad. It would be comforting. It's like, if I had my dad's car still, it would be comforting. I wouldn't be like, oh, that's so unhealthy that you still have it. But what would be important is like the thing I know that my dad taught me, like this thing. And that's the like actual important part. And then it like reminds me of a quality and a value that he had.
Right. That's what I was going to say. What it reminds me of is how we talk a lot about how when the what's have to change or are lost, it's often when you dig down, it's the whys and the values that remain consistent. Like we talk about this a lot with tradition, because oftentimes tradition has to change or feels really unbearable to keep going without the person. And so we talk about like, well, oftentimes those traditions, what you did, they do have to change, but are there other ways to honor the why and honor the value below it? Because that's what it was really about. And so, it does like make me think about that kind of like digging to the core of what it's about. That's interesting. And a great example of that meeting the physical, being surrounded by his car. And you know, it's like a transitional object in a sense. Like it got you to the next place.
Oh, and it took me so long to finally throw in the towel and realize it had to go because I was, I was so attached to it.
But you were in a better place than to do it, you know, like it got you to the next stage.
Completely.
So, yeah. So thinking about attachment and, you know, I hate like leaving people feeling like, oh, well, it's predetermined. It developed when I was a baby and now I'm screwed if it's not one way or the other. So what are some things that people can do if they think this is like a thing, even if they have a suspicion that this is impacting them in their grief? Maybe they feel like, oh, I'm so used to secure attachments. I'm so used to feeling secure in relationships, and now I feel insecure all the time. Like, what are some things people can do?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the first thing that to recognize that's important is that even for people with secure attachments, grief can really disrupt that. If you have, and they've shown this, there used to be this belief that sort of, oh, if you had this secure early attachment, that was great and you would kind of always build on it. But there has been research over the years that shows if we have abusive relationships, if we go through really devastating traumas and losses, that it can disrupt certain things about attachment. So I think being kind and generous to yourself and knowing like if you're really struggling, that isn't a sign that you secretly had an insecure attachment style all along or had an insecure relationship. It is that grief can affect our attachment. And I think that part of this can be learning about attachment in general can be helpful. Doing, you know, we just scratch the surface, but getting to read a little more, thinking about it. And then if you have a therapist or a counselor that you're working with, definitely talk to them about it, especially if hearing this, if you're thinking, oh, wow, yeah, this insecure, the avoidant, anxious, like that sounds like me. I wonder if that's part of this. Talking to them, building a relationship with a therapist. One of the things that they have found in general with attachment, but especially looking at attachment-informed grief therapy, is that when people have had insecure attachments, maybe that anxious type and struggled or avoidant, that building a relationship with a therapist that feels really safe and trusted is actually a place where a lot of healing work can happen in attachment styles. One of the things that can be hard is if you've from very early on didn't have that sense of safety. And then, like, life is complicated. Relationships are complicated. There are a lot of reasons that you might not have had a friendship or a romantic partnership that has allowed you to do some practicing of a more secure, trusting style and trying to establish some new patterns. Sometimes a therapist can be a really safe person to do that with.
Yeah.
And to start to kind of build trust in a place where, even if it's hard, with someone who understands why it's hard for you. But that can also be done in other relationships as well, like in friendships. If you know that maybe you have good friends, but you are a little more avoidant, you've always been like self-reliant. Yeah, I know they're there for me, but I'm not ever really going to lean on them or really ask them for help or really let them see what's going on with me. Practicing a little bit and maybe even talking to some people about the fact that you've been really thinking about your attachment style. You're thinking about how it's been a piece of your grief and that you're working on maybe changing some of your default patterns and looking for some safe, understanding people in your life to practice those things with. I think, all of those can help. Yeah. What else would you do you have other suggestions?
Well, actually, I'm just sitting here thinking about something sort of else. I wish that we had made a note in the beginning of this. But I'm just thinking about how loss of all kinds sort of shatter. Many times we talk about shattered assumptions. Ronnie Janoff Bowman, who wrote about trauma, talked about this, how loss of all kinds can really shatter our worldviews and our assumptions about people and how we feel in the world. And so something I wish we could go back and say at the beginning is that we've been talking a lot about death loss, but this doesn't only apply to death loss. If you've experienced anything that really fundamentally shakes your belief in others and the way you have relationships with others, that of course can throw things off for you attachment wise. Like, for example, if you were in a long-term relationship with somebody who you found out was having an affair, like that can really significantly shake your trust in all sorts of people. It can really extend. You may not just say, oh, well, this person betrayed me. You may start to say, well, if this person can betray me, then anyone can betray me. It might be that you're, in childhood, there's a divorce. You had a secure attachment to your parents. They get divorced and one parent sort of goes off and you don't see them anymore. And that can really kind of throw us for a loop because we expected things to be one way and we had a sort of understanding of people. And now we're feeling kind of betrayed by the person who was always there for us. And so there are all sorts of different experiences and traumas and losses that can cause us to have these sort of life-changing experiences and changes in the way we relate to people. So we didn't say it at the beginning, but I guess what I want to say is if you're listening to this and maybe you're thinking about a death loss, but maybe you're also thinking about a different type of loss and wondering if this is something that's relevant, it certainly is. And I would say all the suggestions you just shared definitely apply no matter the type of loss you've experienced. And if that's how you're feeling, then don't feel like it has to be a death loss for you to go to a therapist or to find that type of support, because all sorts of experiences can shake how you feel about other people and how you relate and really challenge your ways of interacting in the world.
Another piece that I wanted to mention that is sort of connected to what you just said is thinking about your support system and how your attachment style is important there. You mentioned earlier that if you're avoidant, you maybe have been more self-reliant, that may be a component of struggling to reach out for help. So you want to be aware of that. But the other piece to keep in mind is that if we have been less securely attached in our other friendships, if we've had maybe a little bit more of an anxious attachment, sometimes that can relate to more anxiety about other relationships and friendships when people aren't getting it perfectly right and being the ideal support person to us. We may feel even more sensitive or even more let down. If we perceive that somebody has ghosted us or they haven't followed up, if I have a more secure attachment style with my friends, I might be understanding that sometimes people get it wrong. Sometimes they put their foot in their mouth. It doesn't mean they don't love me. They haven't texted me to check in for 2 or 3 weeks. That doesn't mean that they hate me, or it doesn't mean something terrible has happened to them. But if I have a more anxious attachment style, I might really feel a lot of panic that, oh no, my support system isn't being responsive to me. That can reactivate other stuff about our attachment system. Like we're going through the loss, and now we feel like our support system is not being responsive, is disappointing us. And that might activate something more intensely if you have a little bit more of an anxious attachment style. And so that can be something, depending on the nature of your relationships, that can be helpful to talk to friends and other people about, to just really mention to people that you're thinking about this, that you're really aware that grief has just activated your attachment system in such a core way.
Yeah. And also I would say, with the avoidant piece, I think oftentimes when we are sort of really independent, we don't feel like we need others for our emotional well-being. We may assume that that's going to be true in loss as well, because that's just what we're used to. And just a reminder, as if you needed it, that loss puts us into a world that is so different, and it impacts us in every single domain of our living. And so you may now need support in a way that you didn't before, because you had developed a lot of independence and self-reliance. Maybe now you're in a place where it's like, oh shoot, I do wish I had one person I was willing to open up to about something. Or I do wish I actually had a few people to get me out of the house. And so thinking about, how your needs might have changed can be helpful. And again, hey, you know what? I understand there are people who do not feel they have friends they can be vulnerable with and open up to. And like Lisa said, if that's the case, maybe finding a counselor who you can talk to, because it's confidential, that's their job, to just kind of be that person you can have that sort of dynamic with. So we have been going for an hour, and as you may have heard my 5-year-old in the background coming in and chattering, because I guess she finally needs me after an hour of me up here talking. So I guess we will wrap this up, but we will include some links in the show notes, and we are always open to your questions. You can email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com. I'm going to also include a plug for our newsletter. If you are interested in staying up to date with the most recent podcast or what we're writing about on What's Your Grief, what's going on in our communities, what kind of things have we seen that we think are helpful to other people in terms of maybe new research or an article or an essay or an interview. We would love it if you would subscribe to our newsletter. We're doing more. We're making a greater effort to communicate with people at least like once a week in kind of like smaller bites than we've been doing in the past. So yeah, we would love it if people would subscribe to our newsletter, and we can include a link to where you can subscribe in the show notes as well.